In an era where gaming was transitioning from 2D to 3D, various franchises were being experimented to fit this fashion. The most successful case in the eyes of many was Mario's leap to the third dimension. But during the existing 16-bit war, the very Italian plumber's rival, Sonic, was required to also follow suit and enter the third dimension as well. Up to this point, the Sonic franchise had been developed by a combination of Japanese and Western developers. In fact, around 1990, Mark Kearney of Sega opened up the Sega Technical Institute in California in 1990 to train and make games utilizing a Western staff. However, that team was soon joined by the old Sonic team that made the very original Sonic the Hedgehog as well as a number of other Japanese Sega developers to form a mixed team of Eastern and Western developers for the creation of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. However, despite the union, there was clear friction between both sides with language and cultural barriers, such as how much slower the Western developers worked in comparison to the Japanese staff. That, along with having a strong distrust of their very property being in the hands of Americans. While on paper they successfully worked together in completing Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and stayed as one company, STI was practically becoming two companies, the Japanese side going on to work on Sonic the Hedgehog 3, while the Americans were left to only make the spin-off game Sonic Spinball. During Sonic 3's development, the Japanese team did experiment with trying to render Sonic in 3D, but the horsepower of the Sega Genesis just wouldn't cut it, and the idea for it was dropped. But soon, Sega of America announced a new add-on for the Genesis, called the 32X, which would allow for three-dimensional games at long last, including the ever-popular Virtua Fighter. Sega of America was interested in having STI make a flagship Sonic game for it as its killer app, but one major problem arose: the Japanese staff had officially now left. Once Sonic & Knuckles was completed, in late 1994, series co-creator Yuji Naka left and took the Japanese staff with him to Japan to reform the Sonic team, but for the purposes of working on other games instead, leaving Sonic now in the hands of those Western STI developers. And so with the dawn of the 3D era of gaming coming to fold, the American developers at Sega Technical Institute at Sega had the tall order of bringing Sonic to the third dimension. Through three major attempts, many cancelled or cut ideas, and a whole flurry of political setbacks that nearly led to a death, today on Gaming History, we shall explore the complete history of Sonic's troubled leap to 3D. If you enjoy this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Sega Technical Institute was tasked to make a game for the then Sega Genesis add-on, the 32X, codenamed Sega Mars. Being inspired by games such as Virtua Fighter that ran so flawlessly on the 32X, the team was inspired to make the leap for Sonic into the third dimension as well. And so ideas were being drawn up for this 3D Sonic game. The head of the team, Michael Kosaka, began planning out the game and decided to make a game that would be based on the then ever-popular Saturday morning Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon. This was set to incorporate many of the original characters from the series, including Sally, Bunny, and even the original unhinged design of Dr. Robotnik from the series. In fact, alongside Sally and Bunny, Tails and Knuckles were set to return, but also one new character too, known as a princess character named Tiara Bubowski. Yeah, that's actually her name. Was to be introduced as a new love interest for Sonic, thus making 6 playable characters at once. The story of the game revolved around Sonic along with his 4 friends Sally, Bunny, Tails, and Knuckles receiving a message from one of Dr. Robotnik's computers about how he is trying to take over a computer VR world called Micromobius, whereby its inhabitants sent a message for assistance. Several levels were drawn up for this, including the chessboard theme one called King's Gambit, a traditional ice level called Icebreaker, one in New Orleans called Fat Tuesday, a cloud level known as Dreamwave with with a dreamy night sky appearance possibly, a fun underwater level called Cryptic Grotto, one that pretty much takes place in that very computer mentioned earlier called Core Memory, a spooky forest level known as Shadow World, followed by a Jungle World 2, and even one that resembled an American football stadium. This being followed by several bonus levels too that had one with Sonic facing off against Saturday Morning Robotnik in air hockey, a special zone for collecting Chaos Emeralds, Sonic Bowling, and a rabbit race of sorts. On top of that, the idea of the game being on the 32X allowed them to incorporate fully animated cutscenes, which would be perfect for the already animated Sonic Saturday Morning cartoon characters. While several concept pieces were made that featured the said levels and characters, the Saturday Morning characters including Sally and Bunny were dropped eventually, and thus leaving just our base characters Knuckles and Tails, and as well the new Princess Tiara Bubowski. And so began work on making the game that they now dubbed as Sonic Mars, based on the 32X's codename Mars, or at times even just referring to it as Sonic on Mars, as seen with this animated concept opening. Soon, staff was assigned to this project, including Dean Lester of Comic Zone as the game's director, Chris Sen as designer and artist, also from Comic Zone, and Don Goddard of Troy Aikman NFL Football as the lead programmer. And soon enough, the first 3D polygonal model of Sonic was designed, but afterwards, the first real hurdles of this project were felt, the game having a very tough time running on the 32X. The add-on, while capable of 3D graphics, could only produce a few hundred polygons on screen at once, which for a simple fighting game like Virtua Fighter was no problem, but for a level-based platformer like Sonic, that was a whole other beast. And so programmer Goddard came up with a solution of making a Doom-like engine that would rely more on 2D flat surfaces and have the camera rotate in 90 degrees directions, which would allow for traditional Sonic loops even if a bit crude. The idea was for the game to be more on a straight linear path, much as games like Crash Bandicoot would do shortly after. However, the idea was something the team already disliked, as they wanted a free roaming 3D game that would feel like 2D Sonic, and so this linear Crash Doom-like game just wouldn't cut it for the team. And so Goddard started from scratch and instead reprogrammed a very simple proof of concept whereby this build could display thousands of sprites of rings in this case and had Sonic running around in 60 frames per second, collecting them on a black background. The small demo was playable on Sega of America's Daddy-Daughter Day in 1994, whereby company executives brought their daughters to work and played this demo. It was well received. With this encouragement behind them, the team started developing numerous ideas for this game. Seeing that they could mix in a ton of sprites with basic 3D platforms, many ideas were now possible, including making a ring monster, where it would be made of rings and explode into a mass of rings to collect afterwards. With that, designer Chris Sen produced 3 demos using the deluxe paint animation on his Amiga 3000. The first 2 demos are basic designs for levels, featuring linear designs with simple platforms that Sonic can venture through while collecting rings, both looking like something that would fit the whole idea of the story taking place in cyberspace. The third one was conceived by team lead Michael Kosaka, where it was a bonus level to collect rings. In addition, Chris Sen had one more mock-up of an isometric 3D Sonic game too. This one in this case looked a lot more like Sonic 3D Blast with its perspective, and potentially even using 2D backgrounds like this one too. While these pitches were successfully made, they were then shopped to other executives at Sega for approval on further developing this 3D Sonic game of theirs, including Executive Vice President Shinobu Toyoda, President of Sega of America Tom Kalinske, and series co-creator Yuji Naka, their very former team member. The common response was how terrible it looked in comparison to Donkey Kong Country, and how it could never even dream of competing against it. In fact, responses were telling them to pull back from focusing on making a 3D Sonic game, and more one using rings and loops in 2D, which to put the final nail in the coffin, the very co-creator of Sonic, Yuji Naka himself, simply shook his head and said, good luck. Altogether, this put Chris Sen in tears, and their absolute rejection of their working concept was in shambles. Management at this point was telling them that to go on with this 3D Sonic game, they'd need to incorporate a lot more ideas that would only be be possible on a stronger console and would require a bigger team that wouldn't be seen for at least another few years. But not giving up, Chris Sen argued that they could improve upon the graphics, and so the game continued development. But while the game was being worked on for a 32X, and even were able to compile the demos onto a 32X ROM, management at Sega of America was soon starting to see the writing on the wall and considering moving the entire production to their next generation platform, the Sega Saturn. November 1994 hit, and the 32X released, without its killer rap Sonic Mars making it to the market. At this point, the team lead Michael Kosaka left in March 1995 after getting into much tension with STI director Dean Lester. With Kosaka gone, the project was now leaderless and had no real direction. As such, the responsibility now fell to Chris Sen to completely take it over. Already being the game designer, artist, and now team lead, his work only got harder, but even so, having complete control allowed him to now take the game in a new direction he more preferred. While Kosaka wanted to stay more with tradition, Chris Sen wanted to explore new ideas. The game at this point had a soft reboot, with Goddard reworking the game's script entirely, and the game now only having Sonic as the sole playable characters, but with 2 new zones added in. However, programmer Don Goddard was lacking to meet management demands after the Disastrous pitch meeting, and thus came a flurry of interviews with several major industry programmers to bring in new staff, including Midway's John Morgan of Super Off-Road, a cheaper but talented programmer known as Gary McTargat, who would go on to later become an acclaimed developer for Valve and the Half-Life series, and a Middle Eastern software engineer named Ofer Alon, who worked on Astro Chase 3D, a very expensive choice. Ofer Alon was the pick for the job to the team's surprise, and flown in from Israel to start in 3 weeks. This was a mistake. While Alon would initially agree to work with staff on gameplay designs, he would go on to do his own work instead, becoming very hard to work with unless their name was Chris Sen. In fact, Alon became strong enemies with another controversial co-programmer known as Christina Coffin, who was known as the wild stallion of the team in the ability to do amazing work, but wouldn't follow directions, let alone Alon getting into enough tiffs with Goddard, and eventually just locking himself into his room the whole day, which not long after, Coffin would do the same and isolate too. In fact, the programming team as a whole was just turning into an absolute mess, with Chris Ebert spending 10 months just programming a camera to fly over a row of 10 polygons, let alone the team having tension with the director Dean Lester at that. However, shortly after, the game's own director Dean Lester left in August 1995, with Mike Granello taking over and Mike Wallace joining as producer, as a means to prevent the game from falling into further stagnation. However, the reality of all this was coming to the forefront, and a lot of problems stemmed from how difficult it was to program for the 32X itself. After a year on the market, Sega of America realized it was truly a doomed platform, and did not see the point of a flagship Sonic game appearing on it, and that it would be better for it to appear on the company's next generation console, the Sega Saturn. When programmer Goddard was pushed to look at the technical specifications of the console of the Saturn, he absolutely hated it, stating that it was a complicated mess to work on. Even so, there was much push from the team too now to move forward, including co-programmer Hirokazu Yasuhara, realizing that they have to move development over given all the disastrous technical problems, staff drama, and loss of staff in general. And so, in fall of 1995, development of Sega Mars was now officially moved. At first, the team tried to continue development instead on the Sega CD add-on, but very quickly, Sega of America pushed that idea aside and had them go straight to the actual next generation console, the Sega Saturn. But this time, team decided to start development over from square one for a new game called Sonic X-treme. Sonic X-treme's development officially began in winter 1995. As development was about to begin, the lead programmer, Don Goddard, quit Sega as he was told that all his work would go to waste in the transition between the 32X and the Saturn, since he'd have to start over. With Goddard gone now, this left a major hole at STI as the lead programmer was now gone, while the Saturn's more complex architecture was looming, thus leaving the chair empty and leaving only major programmers Ofer Alon and Christina Coffin available. As a result, Mike Wallace, who had taken over as the producer at the end of Sonic Mars development, arranged for 2 teams to be made. A main team that would make the actual levels, composed of both Ofer Alon and Chris Sen, who would serve as the lead designer, but also the only person Ofer Alon would ever get along with. The other team was in charge of making boss levels. This section was led by Christina Coffin. While Alon and Coffin had been at each other's throats on the previous project, here they were able to work independently of one another. While the 2 teams were made to handle different sections of the game, they, strangely enough, decided to both use different game engines. Coffin continued to use the engine she had been using since the Sonic Mars days, while Alon was developing a new one. Quickly enough, 3D environments were being made, with several zones in the works, featuring levels that were non-linear and featured many curves and turns, a lot like the sandbox approach that Super Mario 64 was taking with its levels. But that was as far as ideas were getting, as the idea of how to control Sonic was still a mystery. Being Sonic's first outing in 3D, they had to make a proper transition of keeping his speed while in a 3D space, and by running as fast as he does, it could make seeing upcoming obstacles a real challenge. But Ofer Alon came up with a solution, the utilization of a reflex lens. This would give the game a fisheye perspective, whereby it would curve the screen towards the center, but also allow one to see more of the world on all sides. This as such would allow one to see the upcoming obstacles while going at Sonic's top speed. At long last, Sonic finally was able to function in 3D space with reasonable results. The levels that were being made included the simple test level made of various cubes and platforms to test Sonic on, but otherwise the main levels included Jade Gully, this game's own version of Green Hill Zone, which took place in a lush green watery scape with the titular brown cubes everywhere, an ice level called Crystal Frost with its slippery platforming, a fiery cave level called Red Sand, and early development on various other levels including an underwater one called Blue Ocean, an Egypt-based level, and even a Christmas-themed one that even has Art of Sonic in Christmas garbs. But biggest of all being Galaxy Fortress, aka the Death Egg, revived from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, bigger and grander than ever, with many sections. While the main stages were all well underway, Christina Coffin was hard at work on her side with the boss levels. At this point, she had scrapped any last remains of the old Sonic Mars engine and made a new engine for this one. This one would not include the reflex lens, as it was more of a battle than a test of speed. She took inspiration from various other Sega games she had played in the past, such as Gunstar Heroes, to make the game's numerous bosses. This leading to the return of Mecha Sonic, a callback to STI's days on Sonic the Hedgehog 2. At first they had many concepts on redesigning him in wild and wacky manners, including a red version even. Other bosses included Fang the Sniper, a new character based on a weasel who would use a gun, a first for his series, and would later on be properly introduced as a character to the series by Sonic the Fighter. This along with a boss called Gemstone, which according to Christina Coffin was simply just a test boss, as it was simply a gemstone that stood in the middle, menacingly. Plans also existed for other bosses that hadn't been made yet, including a robot cat called Emerald Cat, another boss called Flame Falcon, which was a bug-like enemy that would transform into a flaming falcon mid-battle. This monstrosity called Mechamite, one called Guardian Sphinx, which likely was for the Egypt level, along with a football player-shaped one and an octopod, which appeared to be robotic-controlled bosses, as well as one boss that didn't even get a design called Dark Pool Gorilla, and lastly an evil Sonic that was actually programmed in, but nothing of that boss was ever seen by the public, potentially an early idea that eventually may have led to the creation of Shadow the Hedgehog. At this point, the character of Sonic had been rendered with 2D sprites that were digitized from a 3D model, much as how Donkey Kong Country had prior. However, Coffin wanted her Sonic in those boss fights to be in full 3D instead, and so utilizing the assistance of Kunitake Aoki, an artist at Sega, who was at the time working hard on the game Die Hard Arcade, took Coffin's request and made it a reality. While development continued on, game story was one that was changing constantly since the days of Sonic Mars, and one aspect of the old story that was carried over was Sonic's new love interest, Tiara Bubowski. The story this time would start with Sonic having just rescued Tiara Bubowski from Dr. Robotnik, but then gets infected with a Doom virus that Dr. Robotnik had laced Tiara's chains with, this leading Sonic to meet Tiara's father, Professor Bubowski, for a cure in the land of Mobius, the same name as the computer land from the Mars build, where he is told that he has to go to various worlds in order to get the proper ingredients to make a cure. But little does Sonic know that the professor is actually Robotnik in disguise, who wishes to use the ingredients to make a cure for himself instead, as he is also afflicted by the virus. And this was the story that development started on, and so characters including Tiara Bubowski were made playable alongside Sonic, which her levels were being made as 2D playable sections in contrast to Sonic's own 3D ones. Along with those two were Tails and Knuckles that were also being designed as playable too. Knuckles' stages, in contrast to the other two, were being made as top-down maze-like levels. Tails, however, isn't known what his playstyle would have been like, and may not even have gotten that far into development to make that a reality even. With some confidence in Sega America, they were now pushing the marketing of this game hard, and stress was starting to build on the team as they and virtually any Sonic fan was looking forward to seeing it in action at the upcoming E3 1996 event in May. Sega of Japan was also now paying close attention to the game, as it was becoming the Sega Saturn's killer app. As a result, new members joined from the Japanese side, including veteran Sonic designer Hirokazu Yasuhara and officially now artist Kunitake Aoki. This was the first time since Sonic 3 and Knuckles that the Japanese staff had returned to STI, and for them to get along better this time, management even awarded the developers with promotional Sonic Xtreme pins. Hirokazu Yasuhara, who had designed many of the 2D Sonic stages, designed numerous 3D stages and asked to be used with an Alon's engine. But the problem was that Yasuhara's levels were designed with a fully 3D map in mind, which Alon's engine wasn't designed around that, and were more restricted 3D maps. As such, despite all of Yasuhara's hard work designing all these stages, they never were attempted. But with pressure building on the teams, both Ofer Alon and Christina Coffin were very overworked, putting in numerous hours to get their sections of the game working. Ofer Alon's section in the main game had already come along a great deal, now even featuring the ability to rotate the whole world around Sonic, even going as far as to imitate some of 2D Sonic's linear high-speed paths by featuring such sections in 3D as well. In fact, Alon had been foolproofing the engine so much that it was being made with the intention of being used for future projects as well, a potential Sonic Xtreme 2 in fact, a dream ready to be shattered. While the game had come along fast within only a few months, now being in early 1996, it still had some serious frame rate problems, making it unplayable in some sections. Despite it still being early in development, management at STI was looking for a way to fix this issue and making sure the game is actually completed. As such, Robert Morgan, the technical director of STI, decided that they would use an outside company called Point of View for this endeavor, a company that Robert Morgan himself had co-founded. This all being done without actually the development team knowing. As a result, one day, both Ofer Alon and Chris Sen were brought in and told about this plan, shown a demonstration which Chris Sen noted that they showed us a Sonic sprite we were already using floating in the upper right of the screen, a checkerboard ground, a rotating shaded polygonal shape floating in the air, and maybe a ring sprite animating. This effectively was going to demote Alon from technical lead to a regular programmer and be replaced with Robert Morgan himself, with Point of View taking Alon's engine into their hands. As the Sega America rep was going on about the demo to them saying we're on a mission, Alon abruptly got up and said, "Have a nice trip," and walked out. Alon was deeply insulted after all the time he had spent on building this engine just to have it stripped from his control. level. Much of this can be attributed to when Alon was hired during Sonic Mars development, as he was pinned as a programming genius with a high price tag. As such, expectations were way too high of him. It also didn't help that he wasn't in the eyes of management so much, as he chose to work in isolation in his office. With how insulted Alon and Chris Sen were, they both continued to simply work from home, but also began working privately on a PC version of Sonic X-treme alongside the Saturn version now being done by Point of View and Christina Coffin, however. It was now March 1996, and Sega of Japan was ready to see how progress was going with this game. As a result, executive Shoichiro Irimajiri paid a visit to them. For the presentation, both the main engine made by Ofer Alon, now in the hands of Point of View, were to be shown, alongside Coffin's boss engine. However, Irimajiri was accidentally presented with two versions of the main engine, one being a modern, cleaner one by Point of View. The second was an earlier version of Alon's engine that ran at a very horrible frame rate. Despite that not being the latest version, Irimajiri was disappointed with how much he thought was left to be done. In contrast, he loved Christina Coffin's engine with how well it ran and at a stable frame rate. As a result, he requested the whole game now be remade solely on Coffin's engine. Basically, Point of View was out of the job as quickly as they got it. Meanwhile, Ofer Alon and Chris Sen were ready to present their PC version of the game at that same meeting, but because of the disappointment from earlier, they decided to hold off this time. At this point, producer Mike Wallace was done with all the politics around this game, and in order to get this game delivered and done on time, he demanded from management at Sega of America and STI to give him access to all the tools he needed and a dedicated team. As such, he got a team of 4 artists, 2 programmers, and 3 designers. With the game hitting a reboot once more, it was decided that the story needed to be refreshed. As such, associate producer Rick Wheeler and designer Hirokazu Yasuhara worked on a new story for this game, one that was much more in line with the already existing Sonic story of the previous 2D Sonic games. The story would take place directly after Sonic 3 and Knuckles, whereby Dr. Robotnik had rebuilt his Death Egg Fortress from that game, bigger and badder than ever. So big that it was larger than the planet, leading to planets leaving their orbit and instead orbiting the Death Egg. And thus Robotnik's new plan was to conquer Earth by taking it in this manner. With the planet already being drawn towards it, Sonic, utilizing a teleporter made by Tails, would travel to the planet-sized Death Egg to try and destroy it before it was too late. Except he hits one of the other planets in its orbit, a strange planet filled with badniks under Robotnik's control, a trap Robotnik had planned here. And so it now became Sonic's mission to free the planet and find a way to the new Death Egg and destroy it. While it is unknown at this point what Tiara Bubowski's fate was, it can be safely assumed that she was now officially gone, and in her place came Sonic City's heroine, Amy Rose, as Sonic's main love interest. Likely another means to tie it to the previous games, which led to the Mecha Sonic boss battle becoming Metal Sonic instead, to also further tie back to Sonic CD. And so Coffin's engine, named Project Condor, was the central focus of the project and given the hard deadline of Christmas 1996, only a little over half a year away for a game that had basically hit the reset button. But Coffin was dedicated to meeting that deadline, working all her waking hours and isolating herself to program, going as far as to even find ways to cut down on optimization by even requiring the Saturn RAM cartridge that would be slotted into the back of the Saturn, in addition to even testing out the game with the Saturn 3D analog pad that gave much more freedom and control to Sonic. But E3 1996 in May was coming quick, and all that they had to show so far were the bosses that she had completed by then. In an attempt to assist in porting levels from Ofer's engine to Coffin's engine, Chris Sen moved out of his apartment and put all his belongings in a Sega warehouse while moving directly into an old STI building next to the main one. This led to the Jade Gully level being ported over, now lacking the reflex lens, as that was exclusive to Ofer Alon's engine and not easy to replicate. And so 2 months in, the project was already in dire trouble with its slow progression. The new CEO of Sega of America, Bernie Stoller, was greatly concerned and met with the game's director Roger Hector and Mike Wallace in the idea of now removing all shackles that were restraining production. As a result, giving them all the resources they need for it to be done. This, as a result, led to the core team moving into STI's former office to work 15 to 16-hour shifts on the game, while Sega fed and gave them sleeping arrangements in order to meet the game's deadline. But shifting to the other side of the world, Japanese team within Sega Japan made by Sega members of STI who had left after Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and now led by Sonic's co-creator Yuji Naka, were hard at work on a new game called Nights into Dreams, which was getting near its July 5th, 1996 release date. Staff at STI had taken notice of the game and felt that if they could utilize this engine instead, they could actually complete the game by Christmas instead of having to create their own development tools. CEO Bernie Stoller took note of this and requested Sonic Team to share the engine code and editing tools of Nights into Dreams with STI. When Yuji Naka heard this, he was pissed. Naka was already one who wasn't fond of his former co-workers at STI, to the point of even looking down on their demo build of Sonic Mars. And being very protective of his and his team's property, he specifically warned Sega that if STI uses any of Sonic Team's code, he will quit Sega. And so the team was forced to abide by Yuji Naka's request and stick to their own Project Condor engine. Eventually, E3 1996 rolled around, a major venue that Nintendo was utilizing at the time to show off the new Nintendo 64 and their killer app, Super Mario 64, in contrast to Sega, who had Sonic X-treme, a game upon reveal showcasing a trailer that parodied Mario being fearful of Sonic's new game while simultaneously showcasing its features. This was met with high praise and thunderous claps, being called Sega's answer to Super Mario 64, now heating up the console wars with the much expected launch date of both games in holiday 1996. Due to how the main levels were not ready yet to be shown within Coffin's engine, old footage from Ofro Alon's engine were being used within the trailer that still included the Reflex sleds. But what they had on the show floor was a boss level that they had completed, specifically that dummy green gem level, this simply being for the purpose of allowing people to play and feel out Sonic in 3D. But behind closed doors, there was an invite-only event for Gaming Press. Here, they showed off a real boss battle against Metal Sonic, first look anyone had of it yet. But despite the love for it at the event, the game's hype quickly started to fizzle as media coverage was at an all-time low. And in fact, to make matters worse, it seems word had gone out about the visit by Sega of Japan's executive Shoichiro Irimajiri to STI and his disappointment with the game. And so, with that now being public knowledge, Gaming Press started to turn on the unfortunate state of Sonic X-treme, even interviewing Yuji Naka on it, who spoke poorly about the project. Soon came Sega's Gamer Day, where they showed off Sonic X-treme once more, and this time with Jade Gully in playable form. This would mark the final time the public would see the game. Sega of America was at this point losing confidence with this game, and were even foregoing its inclusion within their home VHS tape that contained the sizzle of upcoming Saturn games. In fact, CEO Bernie Stoller devised a backup plan for an enhanced Saturn port of the other pseudo 3D Sonic game called Sonic 3D Flicky's Island, in case Sonic X-treme falters, with much of the marketing going to that game now. Despite this, between June and August, designer Chris Sen had been working hard from his makeshift home at the old STI building, at this point having 80% of the game's acts complete, with the last 20 still requiring a lot more prowess, overall growing ever closer to making a complete game. However, disaster struck in the form of illness. Christina Coffin, out of being so overworked, fell horrendously ill and had to start pulling back from the project. And nearly simultaneously in August, Chris Sen was hit with a case of life-threatening pneumonia. Even with this, Chris Sen refused to rest and kept working even though he was either vomiting or incapacitated. This nearly killed him. Eventually, he had to also drop out, having lost 25 pounds and was even told by a nurse that he only had 6 months to live. Thankfully, he survived. In shock, producer Mike Wallace, seeing two major members drop like this, informed management that this game will not meet the 1996 Christmas deadline. At first, STI was told that the project will simply get delayed, but everyone knew that in reality, Sonic X-treme, the game that technically had been worked on since Sonic Mars for nearly 2 years, was actually cancelled at this point after all the trouble and money spent. And soon all remaining ad money was spent by Sega to advertise Yuji Naka and Sonic Team's new game, Nights into Dreams, as their big holiday game. In further irony, when Christina Coffin did return to work, she was now instead a developer technical assistant at Sega, whereby she had passed much of what she had learned on her Project Condor engine to the Sonic Team in Japan to use on their next game, Burning Rangers. The death of Sonic X-treme was something that was felt and rippled throughout the entire company. The lack of a proper 3D Sonic platformer is largely credited for the Sega Saturn's absolute failure in the face of the Nintendo 64 and especially the new Sony PlayStation, something not even the other Saturn 3D Sonic games like Sonic R could fill. And the biggest loss in all this being the closure of Sega Technical Institute at the end of 1996. After being the very team that built nearly all the main Genesis Sonic games, the legacy team was officially shut down after much of the mishaps that came about out of Sonic X-treme's development. Some still stayed at Sega as general employees, including programmer Ofra Alon and Chris Sen, who despite the cancellation of Sonic X-treme on console, kept working on the PC version privately into 1997, which still had all of its known traits, including the reflex lens and the world spinning. When they did finally pitch their build to Sega Soft, a division of Sega responsible for both PC and Saturn game development, the division's head Greg Sewers refused to fund the game and only were comfortable with porting existing Saturn games to PC. After all that work, the level 60% complete, and the overall bad treatment he had received from management when they took him off the Saturn version, Ofra Alon had had enough and left Sega. And with that, Sonic as a 3D platformer was truly dead. Or was it? Reeling back to 1994 on the perspective of the old Japanese staff of Sega Technical Institute, their last game being Sonic & Knuckles. With the completion of that game, series co-creator Yuji Naka, along with much of the Japanese staff that was working at STI, decided to return back to Japan. This would as such leave Sonic in the hands of non-Japanese staff for the time being. However, Yuji Naka's return was one with a plan to meet up with fellow co-creator Naoto Oshima to create a new development team at Sega Japan called Sonic Team, reviving the old team name that made the very original Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Genesis. Their plan, however, was not to make Sonic games and make original games instead, which led to masterpieces such as Nights into Dreams being developed for the Saturn. Meanwhile, the Sega Saturn being on the market meant that a new 3D Sonic game was needed, this being handled by the remnants of STI, which now sorely lacked the classic Sonic team. While they had many visions of what Sonic could be in 3D, they ultimately came to design Sonic X-treme. Yuji Naka, who saw this project, stayed out of it, outside of simply saying, good luck. This project, however, hit many hurdles through numerous changes in direction until the project was outright cancelled. Something that left a major gaping hole in the Saturn's lineup. Something that the board at Sega felt, even with the numerous other Sonic games to fill the void. It was clear that the only way to save Sonic at this point was with its original team, the Sonic Team. As such, the Sonic Team, despite wanting to keep working on other titles including their next game Burning Rangers, were roped into making the big jump for Sonic in 3D. So in planning the jump to 3D, senior game designer of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Takashi Iizuka, proposed the idea of a Sonic RPG as the next jump for the series, a strange departure from what was a simple 2D platforming series. But this was more an RPG for telling a deep story rather than playing like a Phantasy Star game, with the ability of the Saturn hardware offering the ability to tell stories in large 3D spaces. An emphasis on the plot seemed like a good direction, just as Sonic 3 and Knuckles were a good jump. Now serving as the director of the Sonic RPG, Takashi Iizuka approached much of the people who worked on previous Sonic games at the company on what Sonic was to them, and this was to figure out what is the best way to transition Sonic from 2D to 3D. After all, if done improperly, it could falter like other series had at that point, such as Castlevania 64, and to that, much argument was made between the team on how Sonic should function in 3D, and eventually, a consensus was reached. Utilizing building blocks, a simple test level was made. repeatedly. Tests showed the level lasting roughly only 10 seconds with how fast Sonic was, and thus constant trial and error until a test level of proper length was made for the blue hedgehog to run on. Being that these were early stages of the game, character designs were now underway too, with artist Satoshi Okano tasked to make these. Which of course we had our usual Sonic, Tails, and Eggman in what looked classic, but stylized. But also a few new characters, including Spider-Girl and Fly the Bat. On top of that, several locations were designed too, including Mystic Ruins, these extra stages, and even some internals of Eggman's lair, and what might even be some boss vehicles for him too. Now being that it was the Saturn era, the team started to build it as the main Sonic game of that console, and to fill the void that Xtreme just couldn't. And so several locations were being developed, much of which being more forest-like locations and designs from the concept art such as Mystic Ruins here, with one even having a tower that Sonic was to clearly scale, but as well a water level, and what might be the earliest version of the Sky Chase level from the final game, with Tails flying the tornado here. But this was rather deep into 1996, with the Saturn's lifespan planned to come to a close as of 1998, which was set to be the launch of Sega's next machine, codenamed Katana. Realizing that it was futile to keep going with a dying machine, and with how big Sonic levels were going to be anyways, they decided to push it to the next generation as a launch title. This led to Yuji Naka as a result even being involved in the hardware development of the now titled Dreamcast in order to be able to handle what they wished to do. But despite all this work done, the team didn't want it to go to waste, so they decided to place the earliest build they had within the Sonic World segment of the Saturn Sonic Collection, Sonic Jam. And so this became what could be said to be a preview of what was to come, especially with much of Sonic's physics appearing to be similar to his final iteration. In the bold approach to reinvent Sonic for a more realistic story-driven Sonic RPG, this even came down to them even wanting to redesign Sonic himself. This at first wasn't planned for the Sonic RPG, but actually for that game collection Sonic Jam. Artist Satoshi Okano was tasked by series character designer Kazuyuki Hoshino to make promotional art for the game to be featured in the Sega Saturn magazine. Utilizing Hoshino's love for urban culture, this new stylized art of Sonic came about. Clearly, a lot of thought and feelings went into this one design of Sonic, and while it was art for Sonic Jam, Yuji Naka really liked this art and saw potential in it in bringing Sonic into the 21st century, and thus ran an internal design competition between Sega artists on what design they could make based on this to bring as the central design for the now titled Sonic Adventure. You had Yuji Uekawa's, which gave longer limbs to Sonic, a new rendition by the original artist Satoshi Okano, a really radically different one by Takumi Mitake with his odd light blue design and red eyes, and this one by Sega co-creator Naoto Oshima, which had Sonic with sharp teeth. In the end, Yuji Uekawa's design won. This design gave a new flair to Sonic by making him look more adult now, having green pupils, as well as better color balance with the blue better matching Sega's logo. Being that this was the victor, Uekawa was now the character designer of Sonic Adventure, and was tasked to redesign all the characters in this new art style, which while Tails and Knuckles designs were done in a similar manner, Eggman and Amy Rose got a complete redesign that would better fit the new realistic art style that they were going with, though Eggman was initially designed to keep his old design before the transition. And so Sega's next generation console was on the way. The team was ready to take full advantage of its power. For this, they had plans to showcase various locations in detailed 3D, including a Central and South American inspired location. As such, the team took a trip to visit Aztec sites and forests through Mexico and Peru. Of course, it's not like previous Sonic games didn't have such locations, and were all designed from them seeing them in popular media. This trip, however, was to add fresh inspiration to the team, all leading to the team to capture every moment on camera, and led to developing levels including Mystic Ruins, Emerald Coast, Lost World, and the Sandhill level of Tails. In fact, the sandboarding was added to Sandhill simply because they saw people in Peru doing it. Some textures in fact found in these levels were pulled straight from the photos they took. And so the levels were being designed in their earliest state, such as Windy Valley, as seen here in its earliest iteration and looking very rough. Now, a new idea the team had was to make each character have their own story, path, and playstyle, which in addition to that, they wished to include new characters to raise the appeal of the game. The first one of these being the robot E-102 Gamma, who was added in due to requests for a shooting component to be added to the series, and well, the team sure didn't want to give any existing character a gun. Yet. He went through a few iterations with a spiffy one that even featured a hat, but the long limbs, gun, and roundish body were always at play. This along with Biggs the Cat, who was designed more as a character who would be relaxed next to the rest of the cast to the point that he was designed as fishing minigame the character, and the design definitely evolved quite a bit. Always depicted as bigger than Sonic, and at one point much bigger than Sonic, but overall kept a relaxed design, except for this one that looked like an angrier cat, though this one actually looked more like a raccoon than a cat actually. But of course there was also the factor of Super Sonic. The plan was to have him appear anywhere like in the classic games, but since it required designed levels for both Sonic and Super Sonic, he was removed and only kept for the final boss. Now up to this point, the main villain of every game had been Dr. Robotnik, and Iizuka wished to change that up this time with a new villain who would be separate from Dr. Robotnik. The idea being a character that was liquid and transparent, as a means to show the power of the Dreamcast, and thus formed Chaos, the game's main antagonist. Character that would repeatedly evolve and change shape, an idea that Yuji Naka instantly approved upon seeing the concept on it. And following that was Sonic Team taking inspiration from the previous game, Nights into the Dream, whereby these fairy-like creatures existed called Nightopians, were being brought back to create a more in-depth species called Chow. This is part of a new side game experience whereby you could raise them, another purpose being taken for those new to Sonic. With development deep into the mix, this was still a hidden project, but word was starting to get out that Sonic Team was making a new Sonic game after so long. This along with those early concept shots of the Saturn version of the game leaking out. Some as such even thought the game would be called Sonic & Knuckles RPG based on these. Somehow. But otherwise, the main game itself was a closely guarded secret, while large speculation for the game was on the rise. Eventually, Sega announced that on August 22nd, 1998, they would be doing a public unveiling of the game at last at the Tokyo International Forum, now officially titled as Sonic Adventure. This wasn't just some throwaway announcement either, this was a truly big deal to the point of ads being plastered on subway trains, television, and even radio stations. In fact, the hype grew so large, Sega turned this into 3 events now, and was to be streamed online and recorded on VHS for those who missed the event. Hilariously, in May 1998, a screenshot of Sonic and Speed Highway leaked of the game showcasing a version of the level that was a good deal darker in fact. Many, however, took it as fake right off the bat. This along with 4 screenshots that leaked around June or July of 1998 off a French website. Regardless, none of these took away from the hype that was to come. And so, the day of the event reached, and lines were long, with many lined up for hours. The show was presented by Yuji Naka himself, along with famous Japanese radio hosts, and this was where the world at long last saw live gameplay footage of Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast. It was a good 40 minutes of footage that was shown, and a ton of early details of the game were seen. Some just simple small differences compared to the final iteration, like Emerald Coast having 4 instead of 5 springs, but there are also some heavier differences too, like Knuckles having an uppercut attack that was removed. Now quickly enough, some of the early Saturn assets had made their way into this version of the game, including not just the jumping animations of Sonic and Tails looking similar to their Sonic Jam versions, but within the Sky Chase level, when the Tornado 2 transformation scene happens, we see Sonic and Tails in their Sonic Jam models instead here. All clearly left over from the Saturn version of Sky Chase that we saw earlier. Otherwise, within Sky Chase, what we have is an absolute dragon, something that is scrapped by the final game. A shame. Continuing with other levels, Emerald Coast is missing nearly all of its decorations at the beginning, Windy Valley being quite different, being much more open-ended and colorful, with all objects having animations, something that had to be removed for performance. Stranger is Amy and Biggs are seen here, despite not being there in the final game. Twinkle Park's Act 1 being completely different, along with a usable Tails here. Now with Speed Highway at the forefront of this demo, a lot was seen, which as seen in that leaked screenshot, it was much darker initially and lacked a blue tint. In this version, Tails was using Sonic's section for this level however. Along with Speed Highway, Red Mountain also had a decent showing, which here it had Knuckles and Gamma in Sonic's levels instead. I'm starting to see a trend here. Otherwise, the level is an example of a lot of little things differing, such as several different details looking more complex here, like the skulls with a glowing effect and lighting being better. Within Lost World, we see an extra Boa, but as with before, we see Knuckles in a level that he shouldn't be in. Mystic Ruins having a jungle with two paths that didn't make it into the final game, Ice Cap having tons of dead trees at the beginning that are removed by the end, and Final Egg, which has different enemy and laser placements. And what's interesting on top of all of that is that an early version of the final boss's theme, Open Your Heart, is not sung by Crush 40 and instead sung by Japanese metal singer Aizo Sakamoto. Which as such has a more English take on it. And thanks to this event, it quickly became one of the most wanted games out there and emboldened the Sonic team to meet the deadline of December 1998. Meanwhile, just as with this event, advertisements for the game were rampant, with murals of Sonic across Shibuya, along with Sega staff including Yuji Naka himself even dressing up as Sonic characters to support dealers across Shinjuku, Akihabara, and Ikebukuro. And over time, more trailers and playable demos of the game were presented, showing more and more of the complete game, until the game released on December 23, 1998, receiving high praise right out of the gate, with Famitsu magazine even giving it a very close to perfect score of 38 out of 40, with many considering it as a perfect jump from 2D to 3D, akin to how Mario had done previously, and launching only weeks after the Dreamcast. What Sega had failed with the Saturn felt right again. Sonic was back front and center, and the console and the company mascot once more, and in a whole new light. Despite the game being complete, Sonic Team felt the game could still use further polish before getting a proper Western release. For that, several Sonic Team members flied out to the US Sega headquarters in San Francisco to establish Sonic Team USA to focus on localizing the game and set up a two-pronged plan to 1. Further develop and polish the existing game, and 2. Would have them localizing the game themselves for a change, which Sonic Team USA decided to unify the story of Sonic worldwide this time. Normally, there were differences on the mythos of Sonic in entries prior, which would lead to characters like Dr. Eggman to be called Dr. Robotnik in the West. But this time, they wanted to keep it consistent, even if they had to make reasons for the revisions to the Japanese mythos. As for the gameplay, the changes were plentiful. A simple one included a change to Sonic's running animation, whereby the distortions on his feet were removed. But more drastic changes came to the levels themselves, most infamously Casinopolis, which changed the original Cowgirl billboard to this generic Casinopolis design. It was deemed a bit too suggestive, especially with how it made moaning noises when interacted with. You know, suggestive elements, not being something Sonic would ever get known for, which the pinball machine inside was altered to where you can shake it to change Sonic's trajectory, as well as a ball counter added. Though despite Sonic USA's team trying to unify the Japanese and English version with stuff like Dr. Eggman, it seems in the Hedgehog Hammer game, the name Dr. Robotnik stayed in the Western version. On top of that, several camera angles were changed, 3 outside at Station Square, and indoors, 1 more zoomed out at Mystic Ruins, a lower camera at Twinkle Park, a different camera angle at Lost Park and Final Egg, and Chow Garden being slightly offset. And of course, cutscenes in several places were given different camera angles, last amongst them being several object placements being altered, such as the addition of a platform at the end of the roller coaster in Act 2 as Sonic. a change of the shield box to a speed box in Twinkle Park as Amy, which is odd since they don't work on her, an addition of a life box at Skydeck, the falling spikes falling in synchronization as opposed to individually in Lost World, along with the capsule at the end of the level being more centered, along with the springs at Final Egg being on the ground as opposed to being on the wall, the hint box in Hot Shelter being moved, a green barrier added over the doors in Egg Carrier that Gamma can't enter, and 2 Omochao at the Chao Stadium are changed to being closer to the wall. Otherwise, other changes reflected some simple graphics and bug fixes, making for a more stable version, and all packed together to make a complete international version. Now, Sonic is normally more popular in the West. Aside from the usual commercials and ads, a deal was struck with Hollywood Video where they can rent out copies of Sonic Adventure with the Dreamcast as a means to promote the game. However, what they got was a demo version of the game called the Limited Edition, and so eventually came the release date on September 9, 1999, along with the launch of the Sega Dreamcast in North America. The game was an instant success, selling numerous Dreamcasts and thus becoming the console's killer app, and with strong critical reception to go with it, winning awards, IGN even declaring it as the most graphically impressive platforming game released up to then, Computer and Video Games declaring it as one of the greatest games of all time, and overall high praise given to its presentation. Though some reception was mixed on the cutscenes and voice, with some really enjoying it and thinking it fit well, while others thought they were repetitive or just awful. But one thing that was truly unanimous was the gameplay, feeling it was a true transition from the Genesis era, with GameSpot appreciating the straightforward and linear approach to 3D platforming here, and the notorious top reviewer, Edge Magazine, even declaring it as a worthy rival to Super Mario 64. In the meantime, between the Japanese and the US release, there had also been strong sales further in Japan too, a region where Sonic never was too popular. Sonic Adventure clearly had been a major success, and even ended up getting the Western cleaned up version released in Japan as Sonic Adventure International. As massive a success it was for Sega, the game was unfortunately the last game the series co-creator Naoto Oshima worked on for the next 2 decades. While nothing is concrete on why the departure, rumors had been floating around that he ran into disputes with Yuji Naka on the direction the series should go in the end leaving the studio and forming his own corporation, Artoon. What was a dream team that the two put together to create the next major leap ended in the divorce of one of the 2 co-creators. Meanwhile, Yuji Naka continued to operate at Sega, but now located at Sonic Team USA, whereby the team continued to work on the Sonic franchise, firmly bringing the series once again back to the US. A first since the failure of Sonic X-treme, and now working on their next game, Sonic Adventure 2. And thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button for more Sonic and other games gaming history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you liked the final iteration of Sonic in 3D, or if you'd prefer the Mars or Xtreme takes instead. So everyone, thank you for watching!